From 2Keto LLC, it's Keto Woman Podcast with Daisy Brackenhall.
Hello Keto Lovelies, I'm Daisy Brackenhall, and I've spent most of my life struggling with my weight and confidence, and have always had a difficult relationship with food. Even when I finally got to my target weight, after weight loss surgery and eating low carb, I couldn't maintain it and I was miserable. Keto has given me the freedom to fall in love with food again, without the constant gain, loss, guilt, virtue cycle of before. Health and happiness is where it's at now, running on fat. Welcome to the Keto Woman Podcast. Each week I'll be chatting to inspirational women, maybe even the odd man, to discover the secrets to their success so that I can share them with you. So what is keto? Keto is a way of eating that enables you to switch your body's main fuel source from sugar to fat. Who doesn't want to be a fat burner, right? But how do we achieve this? A great place to start is by keeping carbs to 20 grams or less per day. So things like leafy greens and above ground vegetables, plus some nuts and seeds, and the incidental carbs you find in things like dairy. Moderate protein scaled to your lean body mass, and then fat to satiety. Once you're in the swing of things, you can tweak it to suit you. Make your own personalised keto. I'll be asking my guest each week what their keto looks like to show you just how flexible and fabulous this way of eating can be. I'm not a doctor, and most of my guests won't be either, so we can't give you medical advice. It's always best to work with your own doctor because they know you and your medical history, and so have access to the bigger picture. Thank you, Laura Nelson, for supporting me in this podcast by making a pledge at my Patreon page. Do you want to hear your name here at the top of the show? Are you enjoying this podcast and would like to help me make more episodes? Then head to my Patreon page at patreon.com/KetoWoman, or hit the support button on the Keto Woman podcast website. It means a great deal to me, and you will get to headline the show just like Laura did today. This week's extraordinary woman is Dr. Annette Bosworth. Based in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Annette Bosworth, MD, is an internal medicine physician with over 19 years of experience helping patients overcome long-term chronic conditions through lifestyle adjustment, preventative medicine, and other therapeutic paths. She's been mentioned in media outlets ranging from CNN, Time, US News and World Report to Fox News. In addition to medicine, she loves speaking at town halls, jails, churches, and universities. From politics to mission work, she lets her faith lead her to the next chapter of life, always looking for teachable moments. Along with her husband, she savours the adventure of raising 3 energetic, fast-growing sons through debate, wrestling, music and theatre. She fights for the underdog and encourages patients with chronic health problems to fight it any way you can. Ketones for life. This week, though, is a little bit different. And a little bit special too, because it's the 52nd episode. I can hardly believe it's been a whole year. A year of chatting to the most incredible women, and the odd man, of course. What a great pleasure it has been to get to know so many extraordinary people and share their stories with you. There's a team that delivers this podcast to you every week, and I would like to thank them for working so hard to make it happen. Brandon produces and edits the show, but has also become a great friend and has great patience in helping me develop as a podcaster by sharing his knowledge. Ben Parent works his magic with the show graphics, and Nancy Parent uploads all my social media posts and adds all those pesky hashtags. Thanks, of course, to my friends and mentors, Richard and Carl, aka the coolest 2 keto dudes on the planet, who had the faith in me to host this podcast and have the ongoing confidence to let me get on with it my own way. And anyone who knows me knows I like to do things my own way. Thanks to my patrons who support me on Patreon. Your faith in me means so much. Thank you to the KKBs who were my inspiration and who continue to be my rock. Most of all, thank you, every single listener who lets me tickle their earbuds every week. There would be no podcast without you. You are everything. Thank you for downloading, subscribing, liking and sharing. I love you, Keto Lovelies. I said this episode was a bit different. That's because this week we turned the tables and Dr. Bosworth used me as an example patient to discuss sleep problems and migraines. It was a little unnerving being in the guest seat, I can tell you. I've gotten used to being the one who asks the questions. It was fun though, and you get to hear a little more of my story, which I know some of you have been asking me to share. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think of the podcast now we have a whole year's worth of episodes. What do you want more of? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Welcome back to the Keto Woman podcast, Annette. How are you doing today?
I am doing great.
So today is going to be slightly different. I'm kind of handing control over to you a bit, which I have to say is a little bit scary. But we're going to use me as an example to talk about how lack of sleep and having migraines can really impact your health and well-being. So I shall hand over to you.
Well, thanks for being vulnerable. I think the best relationships in life start when we open up our transparency and share. And, looking at your journey of weight loss, but also just the life journey that you share on your podcast, I think is very inspirational to men and women, but especially to women who've really struggled with weight. And it can sound like if you go keto, life is going to be perfect, but that's rarely the case. It has often that there is a bundle of other things that go on in someone's life, and that keto is a great step. And I think unpacking some of the struggles you've had could be really powerful for your audience. So I'm going to put on my doctor hat and just do a little bit of interviewing, and in hopes to, share this story a little bit more. You'll see me do this with any patient that I would see who's rather new to my clinic and struggled with, if we just start with migraines and have you outline the story of your migraines in your life, and then I'll ask questions as we go along.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Right. Yes. So you want to know about my migraine journey, really?
Mm-hmm.
See, and I'm not completely sure whether they're migraines or headaches and whether actually that might have changed over time. But I certainly can remember having headaches very regularly from a very early age. Certainly from, say, my mid-teens onwards, I can remember just regularly taking paracetamol for headaches, seemingly sort of sometimes every day. It seemed to be a very regular occurrence. And it was a bit later on that, because my mother has suffered from migraines for a long time, and she told me about the medication that she takes for migraines, which was triptans. It was one of the triptans that she took. And she suggested that I tried that one day, and I did, and it really did seem to help. So this is one of the reasons why I came to think that they were migraines, not headaches, because the migraine medication did seem to work, whereas things like paracetamol weren't working, and they weren't going away, and they do last for a long time and a lot of frequency, so they'd be coming back a lot. But I certainly don't tick all the boxes for migraines. And they carried on getting worse and worse as I got older, and trying to think about my timeline, but certainly about 8 years ago, before I started weight loss surgery, and actually into the first weight loss surgery, I had the band, which was awful. Certainly didn't have any impact at all. The sleeve, interestingly, a period of time after I had the sleeve, between about 3 months to maybe up to a year, my migraines almost completely vanished. I'm not entirely sure why. I don't know. Yes, I don't know. Perhaps you will have an idea about that. But I also then started keto within that time. So I think that probably had an impact. But my migraines had got to such a point where I was basically getting them for 2 weeks out of every 4, so every month. And I was taking far too many of the medication, these triptans. And I just came to the conclusion that that maybe that was part of the problem. I read about rebound headaches and migraines before, and I got a book about it, and they were talking more specifically about migraines. We're interchanging those pronunciations.
Perfect, yeah, no.
But they said one of the things you might have to consider doing is just stop taking the medication. And I have found that before, actually, when I've had too many on a day-to-day basis, that you have to sort of white knuckle a day or two without any medication to get rid of them. So I started thinking, well, perhaps, I'm just causing more and more by keep taking medication. So I basically did that. I basically stopped taking the triptans, and they did get a bit better. But then I also think that being on keto has helped a lot. So there are some sort of confounders there because I've tried different things at once. But I haven't taken triptans now for well over a year. And I find that the thing that works best now, if I do have a headache, and I am getting them, and where I kind of use headaches and migraines interchangeably because I'm not always entirely sure which is which, but I'm finding that ibuprofen works better to get rid of them. And sometimes the double, if I take ibuprofen with paracetamol, if it's really bad, because I quite often find that I might have a headache in the morning and I'll take some tablets and it won't go away. And it's on the second round of tablets that I get rid of it. So I still do get them where they're going, they can last all day and possibly go into the next day. And they are worse. And I know we're tying sleep and migraines together, but they're certainly worst if my sleep has been bad, which has been consistently bad for a long time.
So you're totally making my job easy. Yes. So let's back up a little bit. So if you could think back to the first headache that you have recordable memory of, were you in primary school with your first headache? Or do you think it was after puberty?
I think first headache probably was in primary school, actually. I do vaguely remember being given the child form of paracetamol or aspirin. I remember the taste. It's a very different, taste, the child aspirin. So I think quite possibly, yes, in primary. I remember them having them regularly in secondary school, but I think, quite possibly
in primary school,
the first ones would have been back primary age.
There alone sets forth a spectrum that when you study brains and why headaches happen, that first headache would have been a much more intense memory if it would have come after a family car accident or a baseball to the head or some kind of trauma. In the way you answered the question, I'm going to assume that there was really no other event around the headache, but that there's this possibility that a headache happened before puberty that was significant enough that you either drew the attention of a teacher or an adult that said, hey, this hurts. And I think therein lies a big part of our history that when I look at brain injuries and the recurrence of headaches, they are very linked to how does the brain look now? And we're now, decades removed from your first headache. And if we could scan your brain to say she continues to this day to get headaches, that it sounds like when it happens, it doesn't just last for 45 minutes. It does take up a couple of hours. Is that true?
Oh, at least, yes. I mean, I wouldn't expect, I'd never expect to get rid of a headache that quickly.
Okay, so you've got these extended headaches that are happening in adulthood. They've been around for decades, and it can ruin your day. It can unshelf any process or plans that you had for the day because the headache won't allow you to focus or think. True?
Yes, completely, yeah.
So let's just gather some more tick points on the history. Tell me about the routine that your family had as far as bedtime. How far did you get up before school? Was it common for you to miss school? Just some of those history points as a child.
I seem to remember, certainly when I was that young, primary school age, that I did have quite a strict bedtime routine, and probably round about the sort of 7 to half 7 time, purely because I remember I think I was allowed to watch Top of the Pops, and I think that was from 7 till 7:30, so we can probably time it reasonably around there. But I do always remember struggling getting up in the mornings, actually. I remember that from an early age. I mean, it's been consistent throughout my life that I've struggled to
awaken,
to get up in the mornings. So as late as possible before having to leave the house is usually the general rule.
Now that is very real in teenage years, but primary school is a specific time to ask this for, because many times the child adopts that pattern of behavior from what the family unit is doing. And so it will not be an uncommon history to double check to say, is that how your family did it? That mom and dad had not a 2-hour time in the morning where they got up and had a cup of coffee and read the newspaper, meditated of some sort. Nope, they got up in time to quick shower, grab maybe a bite to eat or a cup of coffee, and out the door they went. It was a very fast pace in the morning. True?
Yes, I think it was probably always quite fast paced. I certainly don't remember it as being a more relaxed, drawn out affair. And things changed for me around about when I was 9, 10 years old in that my parents divorced. So I went from one family unit to a different one. So, routines probably would have changed then as well. I don't remember it too clearly, to be honest. Not enough to pinpoint, but I certainly don't remember breakfast as being a drawn out affair. It would have been quite a quick, something that you just did as part of your routine to get on with the day, not something that you took time over.
Right. And this brings back a couple of teachable moments that, especially a girl's brain, when you look at puberty and when their menstruations happen, that time has changed over the years, that you'll see young girls going through their first menstruation at about 10 or 11 instead of the 13s to 18 that can happen. How old were you when you went through puberty?
Probably around about 14, actually.
Okay.
So not too early.
Not too early. So, and that's a great little measurement from if 9 is how old you were when the trauma of a divorce happens. It does affect how our brains develop when the child has an unsettledness in the way the rules of family have now changed. And, there's a couple of measurements for how much this impacts people. And you can find that changing homes can be as disruptive as a divorce. Even though nobody got divorced, the family just changed homes at a time where the brain is rapidly developing. And you'll find their brain development isn't as rapid if the stress in their journey is palpable. And this totally links to the pathology behind migraines or behind chronic headaches. Headaches have had the beautiful transition in my medical career of going from a time where we didn't scan brains very often and we didn't have a lot of data to now we can get the most beautiful pictures of your brain. We can study when it's using different hormones, different, levels of serotonin. We can look at how well it's processing sugar and if it's kind of been stunned and not processing sugar any further. And the beauty of being in that phase of medicine is that we now know that chronic migraines lead to this fancy sciencey word called apoptosis of brain cells. And that means programmed cell death, that those injuries in the brain, they don't die the first headache. But boy, if they have chronic headaches and you do a brain scan 20 years later, you're like, man, there's holes in their brain. And of course, they're not holes. They're just brain cells that went offline. Some of them did actually die. There's a scar there. When you get them to autopsy, you're like, yep, there's something happened. We don't know, always what we can attribute it to, but time associated with length of migraines, like you first had them in primary school. Sounds like they got much worse in the teenage years. And then the progression of pain seemed to happen up until even 8 years ago when another dramatic event happened in your life, which is you had gastric surgery the sleeve was 8 years ago, right?
Yeah, but the band was, and then the sleeve is more recent. That's more like 4 years ago. And yes, they've only actually eased up in how frequent and how bad they've been in the last couple of years. It's interesting what you were just saying, though, that it's one of those little flags that goes off when you mention something about moving house. We've changed houses quite a lot as I was growing up. But if a traumatic episode has impact, then that particular time, round about that age, so let's say 10 for argument's sake, because it was a couple of years around that. But so yes, there were my parents getting divorced and obviously moving to a different house. But fairly soon after that, my father also left to live in Thailand. So that was another sort of episode. And I also underwent a sexual attack as well. So it was quite a bit of a triple whammy for me in respect of
it's real
impactful things happening.
It is not an accident that in this history of teaching about migraines and what they have to do with sleep, that I go back to first time you can remember one, and then slow down and take a history of what was going on in your life. You know, one of these benefits of medicine in the 21st century is that you may have heard that as people age, they say, boy, time just goes faster. Time just goes faster. It seems like it was just yesterday that it was 10 years ago. And if you look at the recorded images that our brain takes in, there is a speed at which we can record memory. As you're growing from, birth to about 9 to 10 years old, there is a dramatic shift in the number of pictures per minute. It's not really pictures per minute, but, let's say pictures per year that your brain puts in the file for memories. And when you watch to look at trajectory of someone's life, if you study that summer between the age they turn 9 to 10, now it's very specific for boys that brain development 9 to 10. Girls, if they have an early period, it can have happened before that. But knowing that your menstruation probably didn't start till 14, you're probably right on track with what we would say would be this time to memory ratio. Like if we look at the number of images that you remember, before the age of 9, there were many pictures. And then after the age of 9 or 10 in that frame of a year, it slows down. And what they've learned is if we can, look at the trajectory that was happening during that 9th to 10th year, powerful on how much that sets the course for their life. And you're like, that's a lot of weight to put on somebody. Like if your life in the 9th to 10th year is disrupted and you have, like the trifecta you just talked about, the danger of not recognizing that is that those memories become gospel. How you imagine life or your fears become rooted in that recorded memory where it was very rapid before the switch of the brain where it slows it down. You get to a 70-year-old brain and it's much slower recordings as far as how many memories do they have in the year, especially when you compare back to before that 9th or 10th year. It is a recommendation that I have for parents to say, slow down, slow down, slow down, especially if they're under the age of 10, that what they remember and how your parenting is so powerful for all of their life, but very powerful before that age of 9 to 10. And if trauma happens in those years from 9 to 10 or 10 to 11 or even 8 to 9 for a girl, taking life a lot slower in hopes to put the recorded memories in that child's brain, it sets a path that they will forever have to live with. And so you get to say, okay, we can blame mom, we can blame dad, we can blame the assault. But in the bigger sense, it is just recognizing that would have imprinted or impacted your brain in a very significant manner because of the age that happened. And you say, maybe it was a scar because of the trauma. And you say, wait, I didn't get hit. It was just very difficult to sort. And you're like, no, we still use the same word in the way the brain develops. And then if you look at some of the things I think I've heard in your previous podcasts is that when you were 14, 15, 16 and you got stressed, what were some of the ways that you dealt with stress in your early teen years?
Well, it's interesting when you're talking about the importance of these events at that particular age. And I think part of the problem is that I didn't deal with them properly at the time. And I think it's no coincidence that some of the work I've been doing with a counsellor I've been seeing is dealing properly with them now. Mm-hmm. So I think that has an impact. I think I tend to withdraw into, and it's what I carry on doing now. I withdraw into myself and I deal with things on my own, myself. That's
right.
That's always been part of the problem. And trying to switch off from it. It's something that I've been doing certainly for pretty well as long as I can remember, is sleeping as a way of dealing with stress, is just to switch off from everything.
Right, to shut down.
Is what I try and do. I suppose is trying not to deal with it. And that's probably is something that has been set right back from that time. Is to try and push it away rather than dealing with it.
Absolutely. When you study these early traumas and then the behaviors that are associated with them, it becomes a pattern. I mean, one of the histories I take very commonly in my practice is an addiction history. And we'll go back to say, what was the first time you drank alcohol? What's the first time that you smoked a cigarette? What's the first time that you gambled because you wanted to escape? Looking at behaviors where the coping skills were not mature enough for the trauma, and you did whatever it is that you used to do. Sleep is one of those where that's not a bad coping skill in moderation. I mean, it's like, all right, let your brain shut down. Let's wake back up and talk about this in the morning. As long as that pattern of sleep when you're sleeping is healthy, you can see sleep be one of the top coping skills. Just shut down. But when it is the number one, I avoid and I sleep and I stay in bed, that strengthens that isolation. That sounds like is another one of your coping skills, to say, just back me away from that intense conversation or thought process. I want to shut off and go to sleep. And again, there's much worse coping skills out there, but it will grow. And when I'm talking to an addict who's really struggled, let's just say with alcohol, started in teenage years, very young, usually around puberty because of a trauma, or a neglect is another time where they just said, you know what, mom and dad were going through stuff. My big brother gave me a beer. The next thing I know, I'm needing alcohol most days of the week just to deal with the stress. And if you go into their brain, the coping skill to use alcohol to dissociate, just to escape, is like a number 9 wire. It's a nice thick rope or neural pathway. And then the other coping skills are supposed to have developed at the same time. That's why social relationships at the age of 12 are so important, but they didn't have any of those. Nobody else was drinking, or my buddy that I was drinking with, his mom said I couldn't hang out with him for obvious reasons. I was kicked off the basketball team, so I couldn't have that social interaction. I stopped drawing. I stopped doing the things that made me feel comfort, and I used just the number 9 wire. And so if you could imagine the brain, it has this thick rope for alcohol, but like a spider's web for these other 15 to 30 coping skills. And in many ways, you can see that happen when a trauma happened in your brain during a difficult year. And then you found that if I sleep, I just shut off. And then these other little wires that are supposed to be developing become very, very fragile. Then dad disappears as far as proximity goes the year following or shortly thereafter. And how about, did you reach for food as a comfort?
Well, I was just going to say, actually, yes, very, very much so. And definitely sweet things. I can remember if I had spare pocket money, and I would often do it in secret because I knew I wasn't really supposed to. I knew it wasn't something that was good for me, that I was supposed to eat very often, and it was definitely a kind of a treat food. So I think there was that association. Well, this is a treat. This is something that's supposed to make you feel good. So it's quite a natural thing and an accessible thing for a child to be able to go and buy something that will make you feel good, and it did make me feel good. I mean, yes, that was my addiction. Certainly was.
Absolutely, and the dopamine would rise, and you would feel better, and the comfort would land, and then it would fade, and so then you'd say, "Well, that worked. Let's try that again." And then it becomes the place where the most dopamine is made is repeating the sugars, and
and the two fed into each other. Certainly more recently, where it was very carb heavy. One thing, so the kind of numbing effect of just well, if just eating too much is kind of numbing in itself, but certainly eating sugar and carbs has that sort of numbing effect on your brain. But then, of course, it also switches you off in that it tended to make me go to sleep. So I would just have this cycle of eating sugary, carby foods, going to sleep.
Right.
So yeah, it was just my way out of it.
And this is a perfect tie-in about, we're talking about migraines and sleep. Why have we gotten back to childhood issues and patterns of coping is because what happens to a brain when you push that much sugar in? The first time it's, your body squirts out some insulin, it takes care of it, but the repeated use of it would have led to a higher sugar baseline. And then, of course, the insulin goes constantly around. It never gets a break. You're feeding a chemistry set that not only promotes weight gain, but promotes a stunted brain development, a brain that is swollen. We do a lot of education in the United States about traumatic brain injuries, a baseball bonk to the head, a football injury, a soccer injury, and how much we know that brain will be stunned. And if we can't nourish the brain and remove the inflammation, that consequence of their brain development can lead into adult problems if we don't coach that family and that child to say, no, sleep is really important. In my practice, it's really important that we're checking blood sugars for the child. And I put all of them into ketosis, even at the age of 12, at the age of 13, because when they've had a head injury, it's really easy for them to understand that the bonk to the head caused swelling, and that if you've ever had a concussion, sleep is what they want. It's how you heal. It's a very important part of it. But I would just challenge your mind to associate the overlap of what happened when you carb loaded as a teenager, dealing with some things that you just didn't have the maturity to deal with. And there wasn't an adult around that could either recognize that you were suffering, or maybe they didn't know what to do. Those are real options that life happens. So now you say, well, I don't know. I have these carbs and I feel this kind of sunken somnolence, and then I go to sleep. And you do it over and over and over and over again. And as you watch that teenage brain develop, something stressful happens. That's the repeat story you headed back to. Now you say, well, how does that have anything to do with migraines? Well, if you have a migraine, or if you have a headache that is going to, let's just say we have a crystal ball and we could see that the headaches that were associated with those changes in your life at 9 or 10 caused a scar. And I use that in a very general term, but it's a swollen area of the brain. And then you add sugar and sleep, and then more higher insulin and sugar and sleep and insulin. And now you've got chronic swelling happening in this area that really needed an anti-inflammatory session. It needed 90 days at least of no inflammation to shut off that kind of the gummy milieu of proteins that happen around a brain injury. And your brain injury was caused by, high sugars and too many changes in life. But brain injuries from soccer balls to marijuana to alcohol all cause this kind of stunted growth in how a brain should develop during those teenage years. With a migraine that starts out as the first time you had one, it went away after some aspirin or Tylenol. And then eventually you're like, you know what? I need the harder stuff that my mom was using. So now we have a teenager using a triptan, which is much more targeted at how that drug was going to shut down that inflammatory kind of vasospasm that's happening in the place of the migraine. And you're like, yep, that made the headache go away. And by definition, I would just look at the whole syndromes to say, of course, these are migraines. The intensity of the headache, the response to a triptan, and the length of time that they last are all consistent with the best predictors to say, if I could do a biopsy of your brain to see, is this a migraine? I would say, absolutely. It is a syndrome that continues to happen around an injury in your brain.
And it's so true that progressively you need more and more. I mean, that was one of the things that's just reminded me actually that I forgot that I needed to take the triptans, either more of them or more often to treat the same migraine. That was one of the things that made me think I've got to stop this, because I'm having to take too many, not only for each one, but in frequency too.
Right.
So you do the level of what works. You just have to keep upping it and upping it and upping it until you're taking so many pills. It just gets crazy.
And the level of sleep that comes when people have a head injury or a head pain, a headache, of whether it's from a trauma, of a physical trauma, or constant flaring of a migraine. The brain's best repair happens in the depth of sleep called stage 4 sleep or delta wave sleep. And during that time, we make a very special protein called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this little protein has been kind of the superstar in brain health since the turn of the century. If you wanted to have funding for brain research, you just had to mention BDNF, and practically they got funded because it was such an unknown entity. We didn't understand how the protein works, and could we just squirt some in you and make it do what we wanted, or does your brain have to make it? And the tagline that I like to teach patients when it comes to BDNF is, it's like the Miracle Grow for brains. And you say, okay, so here you are in the 4th decade of your life, and you now have this long history of migraines or headaches. That could you confirm that they are the same type of headache, that it either starts in that same spot and then spreads, or it has a similar history when they come?
Yes, they always start in the same spot. They always start behind my right eye, but certainly they're predominantly behind my eye.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that gets us back to saying this was an original injury that happened during the development of your brain. And now we want to say, hey, we know that the long-term migraines are very dangerous for like dementia as you age. They also promote depression. There are several links to how well your happiness score, I don't like that word, I think it's overused, but just how well you are resilient in the journeys of life.
Well, I've wondered actually which comes first, because yes, depression has been an issue with me. I mean, I really recognized it as being very bad in my early 20s when I started university. But with hindsight, it was there from a much, much earlier age, probably, back to that time when I was 9 or 10. It got to the point where I noticed it because I was, when I had my bath in the evening, I just used to sit there crying the whole time. So it got to the point where it was sort of that noticeable, I think. But with hindsight, I think it started before. I've often sort of thought to myself, so yeah, which bit came first? Mm-hmm. The headaches, the sleep issues, the depression, the thyroid, underactive thyroid. I always wonder which one was the first one, but they're obviously all very connected.
I would contend that it matters not which one came first.
Yes, true. I just like to, I've got that kind of mentality that I like to know.
Right. And the truth is that when I explain depression and sleep and migraines to patients, this is the typical conversation that they come in saying, I want you to fix my headaches. And if I'm doing the best job as their physician, I back up and hear a story that helps me show them. I don't need you to tell me that there was something that happened in the development of your brain. As soon as you said primary school headache, you are in the fringe. That's not normal. And I would contend that statistically something happened. And then the human body does this thing. It keeps collecting symptoms until you pay attention. And you can come in and see me, and I can have this list of thousands of medications that I can use to take you up a couple percentage points in your symptomatology, but it will never cure you until we fix what caused all of this. And that doesn't happen in a 20-minute appointment. That comes with the journey of understanding what happened, and then validating, saying, oh, that had to be so hard. You've got mom and dad making a life decision of ending a relationship that was never supposed to end in their hearts. They didn't start that journey saying, I'm going to end it. And now the heartbreak was so traumatic that, one moves across the globe practically. And then during that time, the primal job of a parent was to protect their children. and then they were emotionally absent, that something happened to you during that time. And so the cascade of just having forgiveness or love or understanding and compassion for the Daisy at 9 years old is really where you must begin as a mental, like, well, what caused this? And I would say the symptoms are just your body trying to say, hey, go back and unpack this. We need to unpack this or we'll never be whole. And it doesn't matter how great my medicines are. They will only change by a percentage point when it comes to how do we restore Daisy's 9-year-old wholesomeness. And I mean, you don't have a job in addiction medicine, or internal medicine is what I do, but I have a lot of addiction patients that they unpack stories that there is no going back. There's no going back to saying, how do we undo that? We can't. But what we can do is have compassion and just the life circumstances that teach them. How do we get through that? And it turns out that's way better than an antidepressant, than a sleeping pill, it might not be better than a ketogenic diet.
Well, that certainly helps. And I mean, you say a lot of the same. I mean, you would love my counselor and his approach, because you know the things you're saying are the same kind of things he was saying. He is saying, and yes, I do think what you're eating has a huge impact as well, and he's seen the impact that can have on my mood. So I always think it's this sort of multi-pronged attack to trying to deal with things. And
so you say, here's Daisy now as a mature woman who's got the wisdom of what the heartache and what the struggles have given you. You know, we can look back and have a pity party for how much has happened to us, but I really have, grown full circle to use my own history of devastation and heartbreak to say, no, it taught me something. It was valuable in that lesson. And if you look back and say, now we get the collective wisdom of Daisy today and say, okay, I can do a brain scan and I can show you this injury, but you've outlined enough of it that I don't need a picture to tell you that part of your brain does still get triggered for this migraine headache. And we've got 4 decades or 3 decades of practicing that angry nerve, that inflamed nerve, to say, all right, now that you've got this wisdom and this insight, let's show you how you could repair that brain. And I think that is step one. Where you get the advantage of the perspective. And so there's some rules about how do you repair a brain that's been practicing a migraine for the better part of these multiple decades. And, number one is don't swell the brain.
Yes, I was just going to say that anti-inflammatory effect comes back in, doesn't it? And I can remember I have, been reading, and even before I started keto, that talking about headaches and talking about depression actually in the same way as an inflammatory disorder.
Absolutely.
So it's a good thing just to bring that level of inflammation down, and that is going to help a lot. And yes, that has been one of the things that has helped hugely with my migraines, but they are still around. So I think we were discussing before that keto really helps, but yeah, it doesn't get you all the way there necessarily.
Right. And I think that the ketogenic diet is, if I have to give it one word, I will call it the anti-inflammatory diet. It reduces inflammation better than anything I can do. I have a little YouTube video out there about explaining the power of anti-inflammatory effects from a ketogenic diet. And I talk about the ibuprofen decreasing the inflammation as much as a nickel. Yes, it does do it, but it's about a nickel's worth. And then I can write you a prednisone dose pack. I can write you a drug of a steroid that will decrease it by like 50 cents. You're going to have 10 times more the effect from the steroid. But when you get to a ketogenic diet and you are 3 weeks into a ketogenic diet, it's like $5. It is 100 times more powerful than my ibuprofen. And then the longer they stay in ketosis, the better that inflammation repairs. So when you take a story like yours, where you've had these much improvement in your headaches, but you're like, Doc, can I take it to the next level? Can I repair this injury? I would push you to do a couple of things. I would push you to check your morning fasting sugars every day. And the reason you're doing that is it's another objective measure of inflammation in your body that you can do at your home. And it is your body and brain and habits being accountable to a number, which can seem a little bit like dictator and, isn't it about how I feel? Yes, it's about how you feel. But if you're looking to shut off that injury in your brain, I need that milieu of proteins around the injury to melt away. And it will do that as long as you don't spike and valley your sugars.
It does tend to be something that I measure. I do tend to, haven't been very good the last few weeks actually, but I do tend to measure my fasting glucose and my fasting ketones.
And how do you fare?
I'll tell you two things that that I'm sure will impact that. One, I'm a dreadful late night snacker. So I know that's going to impact my my fasting glucose, and also I'm sure my sleep pattern does as well, which is shockingly awful.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can come sit in my chair and be the doctor, because that's exactly where this is going. That I will talk to patients about, sleep patterns and what time they put calories in. And it's kind of like their eyes glaze over. I've heard this a million times, doctor, it doesn't help. If I start with data and say, here's a cheap way for you to look at yourself. Just look at what having increased stress, or, you fly over to Keto Fest and you change time zones. What did that do to your sugars? And you're like, why is my sugar so high? Like, this is the stress your system will feel when you flip time zones by 8 hours.
I have to say mine probably improved, actually. I tell you why, because I probably moved into the time zone that I should have been in sleep-wise. So actually, while I was at Keto Fest, I was getting up at 6:30 in the morning. I was going to sleep at a good time of night. I was physically active, or certainly on my feet most of the day. So I was getting physically tired. I was in an environment with friends. I was there was certainly not a whisper of depression going through my mind. I was active socially, had people around me. I was sleeping well. So actually, I wasn't measuring my ketones and my fasting glucose, but I should imagine they were pretty good, actually.
So you hopped your brain into the sleep zone where you matched the sun.
Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. That's what we were looking for. So there's your plan. But the second thing is that history of isolation and how many of us have substituted electronic relationships, whether that's Facebook relationships or, and we have substituted that to a great amount of pleasure. I have lots of Facebook friends that I do think I draw true pleasure and joy and excitement to hear from electronically. But when that is the majority of where our relationships come from, it's a different thing. We have an evolution that says we must touch and feel and connect and laugh and hear and respect in a live relationship. That has to be practice for our brains to really be whole. And so, you've said, yep, I isolated when I went through that time as a teenager. And I've heard you talk about how important those friendships in the keto world have been to you, I think they're real and authentic, but I think your ability to feel the joy from them happens with that face-to-face interaction that we have devalued in our society because we have Facebook. And saying, okay, I went to Keto Fest and the time zone was right, but the friendships were there. The socialization was there. I shut my brain down. And sure enough, the symptoms that my brain has been sending to me, they were much less. I'll end with a story that I think is powerful when it comes to depression and sleep and migraines. I've pushed forward that you can't fix an injury without understanding its origin. That if you come to me for a pill and I am selfish enough to just give you a prescription and say, take this, you'll be better, I would be lying. That when you look at a culture and how much your interaction and your connection with other people is the antidepressant, is the anti-migraine, is the anti-inflammatory that is part of how do you sustain on a ketogenic diet. You must fill those empty spaces in your life with the reality of how hard it is to forgive and move on from an injury that happened very early. So the story I like to teach with is when the world of antidepressants came out, they're called SSRIs.
Oh, I know all about those. I was on them for at least 20 years.
Right? That you should never be on them for 20 years. They're not meant to do that. And you go back to my education as a medical student saying depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain. Okay, right? No. Okay, yes, there's a chemical imbalance in the brain, but it's like saying stretch marks are caused by obesity. Well, okay, but that's not going to fix the problem. The chemical imbalance is there during depression, but how do you fix that? So I want to say Cambodia, I think that's the right country, was one of the last places that the antidepressant prescription arrived as far as the spread of an improvement in medicine. And so they were trying to teach the Cambodian physicians, how do you improve depression? And they said, well, you write an antidepressant. And so the Cambodian physicians would say, well, we have antidepressants. And they're like, okay, what are your antidepressants? And, the scientists were thinking, oh, they're going to hear about these herbal supplements or, kind of like a seance. And they're like, no, we visit them. We listen to them. We engage in what caused their depression. And then we validate their injury. And then we find a strategy that gets them past it. And of course, these physicians from Western America are like, what are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense. And the guy goes, well, let me give you an example. Last year, I had a man who came to me. He works in the rice paddies. And he stepped on a landmine while working in the rice paddies. And he blew off his leg. And he was rushed to the hospital, and we took care of him, and we repaired his removed leg. We gave him a prosthesis, and he went back to work in the rice paddies. But he got back to the rice paddies, and the pain in his leg was so intense. And every time he went to the rice paddies, his heart was his mood was heavy. His facial expression would melt. The trauma of returning to the place where his leg was blown off was causing depression. And, the scientists are sitting there observing the story. He goes, so we gave him an antidepressant. We went to his house. We looked at his story. We heard his story and said, this is too much for your brain and your soul to deal with. We need to find you a different profession. I said, why don't you take up this cow and you milk the cow and you sell the milk in our community as a way to make your living instead of working in the rice paddies? And he kind of did it as he was told, much like my patients take an antidepressant as they're told. And he didn't much believe in this answer at first, but about 2.5 weeks later, he comes back into the physician and his facial expression is whole and the pain in his leg is gone. And the purpose of his day is about how to milk a cow. And it's almost like a bad joke. You go to Cambodia with depression and they give you a cow as opposed to Prozac. But the truth is that the depression score in how much he was improved by collectively understanding his whole story is a far better sustainable injury or sustainable plan and sustainable antidepressant than Prozac ever had a chance of being. When I write a prescription for an antidepressant, I know that in the score for measuring improvement, it's called a Hamilton score. And it's, if you're at 1, you're chirping and joyful and you get pleasure from seeing the sunrise, very easy to feel pleasure. But if you're close to 50, it's very critical that you may commit suicide. And we know that if I improve your sleep habits, and I just say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make your bedtime this. We're going to have no electronics in the room. We're going to, meditate before you go to sleep. We're going to train your brain how to shut down again. And then this is when you wake up. Even if you didn't sleep all night, this is when you need to get out of bed and there's no napping until supper time or till bedtime again. that if I just improve those sleep habits, I can increase your score by 6 points. But if I write you Prozac, the best I can hope for is 1.8 improvement in the points. And sure enough, if they're on the verge of committing suicide and they're very depressed, chronically anxious, that prescription is life-saving. There's no doubt. It works. It's got very good evidence behind it. But it's just meant to be this trickle to move you away from the edge as we holistically address these other issues. And I would contend that if you fail to communicate to your patient that this pill is just this sprinkle to help you, we now need to engage a support group, a circle of friends, a purpose, forgiveness, your faith, your community, acts of service. All of those become the antidepressant, the somnolence factor, the anti-migraine pill are wrapped in this approach to a full life that is not isolated from people, that has a purpose, that has acts of service, and I would contend has a bunch of ketones, especially if you have injuries.
Yes. And dogs in my case. It's interesting when you were talking about the story in Cambodia about the paddy rice farmer and changing him to having the cow. And I think there is that link with animals as well. That certainly is something that's helped get me through. And as a weird little aside, but what's given me a huge amount of joy in this last week. So it's maybe a sort of a reactive thing after my counselling session last week, but caused me to just have a little look online about adopting a dog. And I'm actually going through the process of adopting another dog, and that has really changed my mindset, and it's something that I know that has helped me a lot over the years. It hasn't instantly solved my sleep issues, but so it is. You're right with that connection.
Mm-hmm.
It is something that, yes, you need to have the human connection as well. I think is something that is missing too much from my life.
If I got to write a prescription pad for what I like to see when I've, unpacked somebody's story about a migraine and we've touched on that they have suffered other symptoms associated with this original injury, even if they can't reflect to show me the injury, it doesn't mean that I don't believe there was one there. I mean, like, you have a very nice insight. You have had either somebody walk you through some of the beginnings of this story, or it sounds like you're currently continuing to unpack that chapter of your life. But many times, especially in addiction, their brains are swollen and inflamed, and they don't have that insight. I assign them a few things. Number one, they find a tribe. That your counselor sounds like a really good place to begin, especially for the heavy stuff. But I think I said this in my last podcast that, a support group of just checking in for ketones every week, or maybe it's a book club, or maybe it's like how to train a dog. I don't know, like other time where you meet once a week, it becomes this level of priority where you stay committed to the meeting of the group. Even if you've fallen off the wagon, it's not about being perfect. It's about the relationships that you're connecting to. I've had people say, what happens if you're irritated by the people that you're connecting, that are in your group? And I'm like, first of all, welcome to life. That happens. Instead of running away from the group, practice that journey of just saying, I'm irritated with you, using a full engagement in a group to express, how do you get through when life's not ideal? Okay. That's great learning grounds. But the second thing is that, to follow a process of brain repair, I will start with those morning sugars and as a way to keep accountable on a ketogenic diet. My pills don't work nearly as well as that diet does. And then we start working on other things like, okay, what do you think we could improve about your sleep habits? So I know we're drawn to the end of the hour, but I would love to hear what does your sleep habit look like at night?
Shocking. I've always been a bit of a night owl, but I tell you the problem, and it depends. If there's somewhere I have to be, but I'm quite flexible with what I do. I garden and I don't have to be anywhere at a particular time. And what you were saying about having fixed hours for when you sleep and when you wake up. And I know the theory of that. I know that's what I should do, and trying to force myself back into a good sleep pattern, because I basically sort of come back from America, and I'm probably still on American time basically when it comes to sleeping, but I find it difficult. So I mean, I went to bed probably round about 2 last night, or more accurately this morning, but couldn't get to sleep. And this has been happening with me a lot the last few weeks. It's that I can't get to sleep. I lie there. I can't get to sleep. I might get up, have a cup of tea. I might watch a bit more TV or something, trying to get to sleep. Finally getting to sleep as the sun's coming up. So then, of course, when I do finally get to sleep, I'm probably not getting very good sleep because it's light. And so I'm not getting the kind of quality sleep I should get. But then all my motivation is gone. So I could say, and I understand the process, and that's what I should do, that regardless of whether you've got any sleep, you've got to make yourself get up at 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning, regardless, and see that day through. But when it comes to that time and I've only had a couple of hours sleep and the alarm goes off, it's like, there's no way. I'm not getting up. I've started to feel sleepy now, and I can't make myself ignore that and get up regardless. So, and I don't know what the answer to that is, other than to somehow find a way to make myself, I guess. So basically not sleeping until very, very late, and then quite often sleeping a lot of the day.
So let me help you. There is great evidence that says you cannot force a brain to go to sleep. Okay, there's a couple of meds that I could give you that would force your brain to go to sleep, but without medicinals, you cannot force a brain to go to sleep, but you can force it to wake up. And when you're looking at the reset, when you have that lingering sleep that's halfway in the morning, the depth that repairs that inflammation is non-existent. It is a subtle, it's like, yes, their eyes are closed, but they are getting none of the points that it takes to repair a brain. And so I've used imagery in the mornings for patients to say, how do I do this? I'm stuck. And as that alarm goes off at 7 o'clock in the morning, as you're trying to reset these habits and you've had a fitful night, the image that I would ask you to look at is to imagine that section in your brain that has had this kind of like gummy glue over it since you were 9. And we're trying to absorb all of that. And during the day, when you're up and out in the garden and doing the things that a sunlight would allow you to do, your brain gets the benefit of the appropriate cortisol to respond and the anti-inflammatory effects of being awake and up and about. You can be sluggish all day, but that next night, might not be perfect, but the next night will be easier for your brain to sleep. And by respecting the morning awake times and then imagining the reason you're doing this isn't to have the best podcast or isn't to have the best day. It's to repair an injury that's been there for decades. And we know that it takes that, consecutive 6 hours, and that 6th to 7th hour of sleep is one of the best reparative times. And if you're waking up, for pockets of sleep during that time, and then you're saying, but I'm just going to sleep more so that I have a little more rest. You need to do that into night's sleep. And just transplanting that restorative sleep is what you'll get tonight, instead of lingering in the morning and you get like 20% of any restoration and you get no brain repair when that's the pattern that you're stuck in. And of course, if you have an accountability partner, like husband says, okay, explain why I'm trying to do this. And I know I've had a bad habit. How do I break it?
Well, that's part of the problem, you see. There's no one here to make me, but I can see what you're saying. And that makes total sense with the times so often recently where I haven't been getting to sleep until it's light, or maybe not long before it's light. And then I've probably only been getting about 6 hours, if that. And it's not good sleep. I've kind of instinctively known it's not very good sleep, but I didn't realize that it can never be as good sleep when you're not sleeping at the right time of day. I just thought it wasn't very good. I hadn't realized. So that's quite a good motivation. So you're saying that the most important thing I need to focus on is getting up at a certain time, regardless of whether I've had any sleep the night before.
Yeah. I think the awake time sets are really valuable as some of the things that I don't like to compromise on for patients. There's a couple of studies out that said we studied night shift workers who'd been doing the night shift for 20 years, and they still had that morning cortisol rise between 4 and 6 in the morning, even though they'd been awake all night and they're typically sleeping from 7 until 3 in the afternoon or whatever their sleep hours were. That's crazy, but that's still 20 years later. Evolution has said sleeping during the night hours still fits with the best brain repair and sustainable cellular health when the sleep matches. Now, take some other things. So if we set an alarm clock to say, okay, just make that your compromise, that you say, okay, I'm just going to get up and in my jammies, I'm going to go walk around the house 3 times with the dogs. And by the time you've seen the sun and your brain is awake, you're just that's step 1. But the other parts to saying, well, how do I get my brain to do that? I'm very adamant about saying, I can help you. I can force your brain to wake up the little nerves that allow sleep depth to happen. And I love the sleep lab. That's where my kind of first love for sleep showed up, is to watch what happens during sleep. But with some of these medications, you can repair in 3 nights of sleep what it would have taken me 6 weeks of resetting sleep habits in the sleep lab. I mean, that's powerful. Like, okay, let me fast forward through all the crap that's not getting better. Let me help you through these first 3 days. But it's kind of like that first part of a ketogenic diet. If you're only going to be ketogenic for 2 weeks, then what did I do that for? I mean, it's not the healthiest thing to do to somebody. The habits weren't sustainable. We changed too much at once. So I really focus on saying, yep, that 7 o'clock wake up time is one thing, but here's some other really important rules of sleep. And especially if you're the only one in your bedroom, are there electronics in your bedroom?
It depends, because I know I'm not supposed to have. So, if I'm behaving, then not. What I do sometimes have is it's on my phone, is listening to an audio book or something, because sometimes I find, because the other problem I have, and I call it brain whirring, is that I might even be physically really tired. So I might have, worked long hours in the garden and be physically tired, but I cannot get my brain to switch off. And as I'm wanting to go to sleep, it's just thinking about anything and everything, all the million one things that I've got to do that I haven't got around to doing yet. And then I start getting stressed about that, and I start thinking about things in detail. Sometimes if I can focus on something like a podcast or an audiobook or something like that, it can train my brain enough to switch off. So but I try not to have anything other than that. I turn the alarm clock down so that I can't see it and things like that.
Yeah, those are hypnotic coping skills. Like your brain spends time listening, and then the checklist that was really adamant before the audiobook started is kind of hypnotically listening to this book. Especially, you'll probably have an opinion about the voice you like to listen to. You're like, oh, I really like the guy that reads this book, and I've listened to all of his audiobooks. So his voice has become this hypnotic place. That's fine. It's a skill that you're learning to say, shut down the checklist. But I would encourage you to be in control of that. So have you ever heard of the Muse headband, M-U-S-E headband?
No.
So it's a headband that has, I was just looking to see if it was on my shelf. The headband has a little sensor behind each ear and then on the forehead. And it is hooked up to a smartphone, and you don't need to be a doctor to do it. You can buy it. It's MUSE headband. And it is to train people what brain waves awaken when you meditate. So meditation is what you're trying to do. You're trying to shut off the checklist. This is a skill that you can't do great the first day. You're going to have the checklist show up in your mind. You're going to stop breathing in the deep breathing after like the 3rd breath. But as you grow the skill, that's what we're trying to have you ignite when you go to sleep. That's the part of the brain that when you shut it down, it repairs better. Why do studies that say if they're truly meditating as a practice in their life, their depression got better, their headaches were better, their focus was better, their diabetes was better? Like, how does that have to do with blood sugars? But I contend it's part of the same rhythm of sleep that is awakened once they learn how to do that. And in all fairness, you were supposed to learn that right around the puberty age of what is the skill to shut down your brain. And if your body was saying, heck, we're just surviving, we're not learning meditation skills at 14, you need to learn it now. So the Muse headband is, again, biofeedback. When you hit the brain wave that is meditation, a little bird will chirp in your earbuds. As if to say, the people who are most zen, they can have a bird land on their shoulder and be chirping and not move or not scare the bird away because they're so zen. Okay, that's a brainwave. And the brainwave can be taught to you by saying, oh, let's take a deep breath. Let's practice this during the day. I would contend, especially if you haven't slept well, to sit outside, use Muse headbands are wonderful, but they cost a couple $100. But I think it's one of the fastest tools ever to teach someone, how do I do this? And then there has to be a good why are you doing this? And that is, there's this part of your brain that even in a ketogenic state continues to flare whenever it's multiple days of not sleeping, or whenever I fall off the bandwagon and have more sugar than I'm supposed to. The inflammation comes back, and bam, there comes the headache. And I can say, okay, we can white knuckle how to improve your diet, but until you figure out how to calm down your own brain and shut down your brain at night, we're going to have this cycle repeat over and over and over again. And those are some of the biohacks or life hacks, is to watch yourself. Don't make me the teacher. Let this tool be the teacher at any time in your life. And maybe that needs to be your support group. People figuring out how to meditate.
Yes, and there's definitely a correlation between sleep or lack of, or having got poor sleep and headaches. I've noticed that.
You feel that too? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
And what about, so do the migraines get worse when you have when you're off ketosis as well? Can you notice that they come back if,
Oh, yes, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And you understand that, right?
Definitely. Everything's worse, really. Yes, depressions are worse, migraines worse, sleep patterns are worse.
Yeah, your classic textbook.
And that's part of the thing with the slight, the addiction of sleeping and switching off. It sounds good. You're getting a lot of sleep, but you're getting the wrong type of sleep at the wrong time of day. Yes, I can see the importance, and I've watched your video about sleep, and it kind of terrifies me how I'm killing off brain cells. So can you repair this damage that you can do to your brain cells with headaches, with lack of sleep, with depression? Is it something that you can repair by improving those things?
Daisy, if you had met me 8 years ago, before you had your banding, and you would have come to ask me the question, I would have said the cause of that brain injury was at 9 years old. But now the perpetuation of the injury is the high carbohydrate diet, the poor sleep, the depression that keeps cycling back and, making it more difficult to have the next best decision. But when I stopped my world to say this diet can do way more for repairing the brains in my clinic than any prescription, bar none. I have the privilege of writing prescriptions that are powerful, but none of them are as reparative to the brain as the removal of inflammation that happens in a sustained ketogenic state. That when you look at folks with your story, because they are so abundant, it's why I was so excited to do this podcast specifically with you, using your story to say, do you know how many people have this exact same story? And when they come in, I get this flash of a window to help them, when what they really should have is the history and the journey and the education that we've done in this last hour plus. In response to saying, can you heal it? Yes, but you must have a sleep cycle that gets you all the way to sleep and holds between, 6.5 to 7.5 hours of sleep. It must have a time where the cortisol in your system is low enough that you don't end up with 120 blood sugars in the middle of the night. That's swelling in the brain. That having a low carbohydrate diet where ketones are bathing that injury, not for a day or a couple of weeks, but for 3 to 6 months. And when they can do that, we find a powerful repair. Like, I have a couple of people who are young boys. First migraine was in the 1st grade. So bad, he's like, I could see the tunnel vision. It was about to be gone. And then as soon as the tunnel vision left, this horrific nausea. I was throwing up. This cycle of migraine started in the 1st grade. In the last 4 years, he's been ketogenic. And he's, I think the last time I talked to him, 6 months out from the last migraine. I mean, that's like a gift to him. He's like, I've never gone that long without a migraine. It didn't happen the first week he went keto. Yes, there was an improvement, but to say we finally got that brain to repair and to weave that electrical conduction back through this place that's been offline for decades can only happen when that inflammation is persistently low. And I contend that's, finding your tribe on a ketogenic diet, checking those morning fasting sugars, and then putting those boundaries at that sleep happens when it's dark, as does shutting off the checklist in your mind by learning the skill of a meditative process for somnolence.
And is there somewhere you can recommend to training your brain into that meditative state?
There's 2 things I do with a patient when I'm trying to decide how aggressive to be with their treatment plan. I do this with them every time as I give them a piece of paper. I clear out all of their electronics, turn them all off, and then I have them hold the writing utensil in their left hand if they're right-handed, and then I have them hold it in their right hand if they're left-handed. So it's called the non-dominant loops. The cursive letter L kind of looking like loops all the way across the page. I will demonstrate that for them and then say, okay, this is what I call, and I'll be using my left-handed loops. We're going to set a timer for 3 minutes. And during the 3 minutes, there's no speaking, no giggling, no farting, no burping, just quiet as you do these left-handed loops. And that's all I explain to them at the time they start. And they kind of look at me like, what are you doing? But as I do this 3-minute process with them, and I'm doing it too, just so they can example and see this is what we're doing. It's not about how pretty the loops are. It's not about how straight the lines are. It's about what happens to their system as they enter into that 3 minutes of one of the most basic meditation states, which is distracting the opposite side of the brain, that non-dominant side. And then if I'm mindful enough, I can watch their breathing, and the breathing will slow down a little bit every minute. Now, if they get to if we could do it for 10 minutes, the 10-minute study is much better. But the 3-minute one is powerful for teaching them to say, this is what it looks like to shut down your brain. If they can't get through that 3 minutes without laughing or giggling or throwing their pencil or getting frustrated, then they need a therapist. And I say that because there's just so much that they're sorting, that the skills are very, very immature. And that's not a bad thing. It's just that no one's taught them. But if they can get through those 3 minutes, then I start to say things like, if you'd like to learn how to do this, and I usually pull out the Muse headband and I show them what that tool is like. That's a very powerful one on your own, and you get to grow with it. But there are other apps out there that I've used to say, just use this as a guided meditation to shut your body down every night for sleep instead of the audiobook. Because the audiobook, you are kind of hypnotizing and you're not mindful that you're actually shutting down. But when you do the meditation and you're saying, no, I'm listening to this process to shut down my body. Now it's that hypnotic kind of shut down the brain, but you're doing it with intention, giving control back to you. And I've just found that's been a super big turning point when they're at this phase that you're at, which is, okay, I've got the TV out. I turn off the phone. I don't let people text me after this hour, but I still need this audiobook to shut down with. And that's, again, your skills are, advanced, but not independent.
Yes, I have tried guided meditations actually, so I'll have to look into those more. I'll definitely try doing the L's with my left hand.
The first time you do it, it's weird. It's like, can you be quiet the full 3 minutes? So good luck.
I will definitely try that. And yes, I am going to try implementing the things you have told me and see what happens, because I do have that motivation. It terrifies me actually thinking of killing parts of my brain off. So yes, it's a good motivation to really try and make it stick.
Yeah, I do a workshop that's about 6 hours long, and we start with, it's called Brains of Addiction, From Trauma to Repair. And it was initially for chemical dependency counselors, but I can't believe the number of I have had a couple of migraineurs saying, my mom came to this and said, I need to come watch this. Just for the record, I'm not addicted to anything. And of course, by the end, they've seen many things that if you want the brain to repair, here's the rules. This isn't a guess anymore. We know how to do this. But I think hearing that as an adult and saying, oh, I have control to help with this is inspirational and powerful, as opposed to, uh-oh, your brain's been damaged and you're in trouble and you're 40 years old. Good luck. Hope you can do that. Oh, that's terrifying.
Yes, definitely. I will let you know how I get on. You've given me a lot of helpful tips there. I wonder if you've got a top tip to leave us with out of all those great tips.
Right. I have thought about that again, and I really go back to what I said the first time, which is those interpersonal relationships, when they're absent, they cause symptoms. It is a level of loneliness that if you went back to the 1960s and said, how many people could you call in a crisis? The average number in America was 5. But if you look today, the average, the most common answer is 0. That their relationships are not as intimate to rescue in a crisis. And it doesn't have to be mom and dad. It is a development of other people that are lonely and are looking for common threads. So my top tip returns to find a tribe, stick with the journey, even if you get irritated with them. It's about those interpersonal skills that are coaxed and developed in relationship, in a group. Call it a book club, call it keto club, call it migraine treatment. I don't care. That really is about how have I looked and touched a relationship that is a place where we come together as a growing unit. And I think that's my top tip again, is just find your tribe, put it on the top of your priority list that you attend every week, and then know that it is helping both you and the people showing up with things from migraines to diabetes to cancer prevention. Those relationships are palpable and they matter.
Well, thank you very much. It's been different this week, but yes, I've gained a lot from it. Thank you very much, Annette.
Well, thanks for letting the tables turn and having the questions be asked of you. It's been wonderful to hear more about the wonderful and marvelous woman of Daisy.
Oh, well, thank you. We'll have to get you back on soon to maybe answer some questions from the listeners.
Absolutely.
They can ask Dr. Boz.
Yes, that'd be great. I'd love to do that.
Thank you very much.
Perfect.
I recorded this episode quite a few weeks ago now, so I can update you on my progress. I actually started clamping down on my shocking sleep routine straight away. I think it was the visualization of brain cells dying that did it. Getting up early in the morning is the hardest thing for me, especially if I haven't had enough sleep, so I did try and tackle it from both ends. I got strict about switching social media off at around about 11 p.m, which is hard for me because a lot of the people I interact with are in the States when it's their peak time. Ultimately, though, I realise that I have to prioritise my health and can catch up with comments and posts in the morning. That, I have to say, has slipped a little bit and I need to tighten it up again. So if you see me online past my bedtime, tell me to go to bed. I've shifted my long dog walk to the morning instead of the evening to get a good dose of morning light, which apparently helps your body clock keep the right time. Thanks to Terry Lance for educating me on that. My other bad habit is snacking late, and I'm still struggling with that a bit too. I know it impacts my ability to get to sleep, and I sleep more restlessly if I've eaten late, so that's the next thing I really need to drill down on. Overall, though, I've made big changes in a fairly short space of time, and am feeling much, much better for it. It most definitely impacts my mood, productivity, and clarity of mind. I was getting more forgetful than usual and finding it really hard to focus and concentrate, never mind being grumpy a lot of the time. And all of these have improved. Getting to sleep is still sometimes hard, and I do find my audiobooks help. Although it's true that I engage with them, they also engage my mind just enough to switch off the brain whirring I tend to get. And I know I don't fully engage because I miss big chunks of the story and nearly always have to listen to that section again the next day. I have to say, I had got to the point where I was a bit desperate. I knew getting to sleep so late, often daylight type late, was a big problem, but just couldn't seem to fix it. So a big thank you to Annette for sharing her wisdom and helping me find the determination to get it sorted. To get the resources and links from the show, please go to ketowomanpodcast.com. Are you my next extraordinary woman? Maybe you've got an idea for a show, a topic you want to hear about. Let me know how I can tickle your earbuds by dropping me a line at daisy@ketowomanpodcast.com. If you fancy joining me on this exciting adventure and want to help me create new episodes, please go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/ketowoman or simply hit the support button on the Keto Woman podcast website. It's thanks to the two keto dudes that I'm hosting this podcast. So please consider heading to their Patreon page at patreon.2keto.com and help them bring you more podcasts like this one. Please help other people hear about and find this podcast by reviewing the show on iTunes and Facebook. Every star and review really does help. It doesn't go unnoticed by me, the people who regularly like, share and comment on my posts. Your support means the world to me. Thank you. This week's end quote is from Margaret Mead, given to me by Sarah Hung, and it feels very apt to me, being part of the wonderful keto and low carb community, as well as my very special KKB community. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Bye-bye, and thank you, Keto Lovelies.